Hey, today I'm going to show you 3 different ways how you can transfer a sketch or a drawing onto watercolor paper. I'm going to go in the order of cheapest or most cost-effective to something that's going to need a little bit of an investment if you don't already own those tools. For method number 1, you're going to need a sketch. You are going to need some watercolor paper. But let's be real, you're going to need these 2 things for all 3 options. Now, the one thing you're also going to need for option number 1 is some graphite paper or carbon paper. I'm sure you've seen this before. If you haven't, let me show you what it looks like. Graphite paper has 2 very distinctive sides. You have the side that is actually coated, and then you have the side that is shiny. So when you start, you're going to want to put the matte side that has the graphite on it down, and you're going to put it straight onto the watercolor paper. You're also going to need a pencil of some type. I like to use a mechanical pencil because it is always sharp and has a really fine point. And what this means is that as I transfer the sketch onto the watercolor paper, the trace it's going to leave is also going to be very delicate. Now you have to be careful. Tread lightly, so to say, because everywhere where you put down your fingers, you may transfer the graphite onto the watercolor paper. So I try to touch it as lightly as possible, knowing though that I have to hold it in place so that my sketch doesn't get messed up and moved around. So that being said, I basically start sketching directly over the original sketch. And I'm going to speed this up for you a little bit. You're going to notice when I take this off that my sketch is a little messy. So let's do the big reveal. So you can see here what I mean with make sure you don't move the paper. I did a few versions of the first step here for you in the video to get a good recording, and clearly I moved, if only by a few millimeters. So you see this is exactly the problem that you have if you don't hold this tight and only go over it once. You can also see it gets much darker if you go over it twice. Again, that happened because of my recording, but over here on the top, that is what I would expect the result to look like. For option number 2, you're going to need a light board, and it also usually requires some source of power. So in method number 2, you're going to reverse the order. You're going to layer the sketch directly onto the light board at the bottom, and then you are going to take the watercolor paper, place it face up with the side that you want to draw on, and you're going to find a good arrangement where you would like that drawn. So I'm going to do it right next to it so you can see the direct comparison. And then you're going to adjust the brightness until you can see it really well. Now you can see this direct comparison of the 2 methods. So I'm going to turn off my light board and move on to show you option number 3. For method number 3, you are going to need a lot more tech. You're going to need, first, a scanner, some kind of flatbed scanner. You're also going to need a tablet, an iPad, or the like. You're also going to need a printer, but to be honest, I did not feel like carrying that over to the camera. First things first, you're going to take your sketch and you're going to put it face down onto the scanner bed and do your thing with your scanner like you usually would. Once you've opened whatever drawing application you use on your drawing tablet, in my case it is an iPad with a Procreate app, then you have to go and you import the file that you just scanned as an image. Once you've imported it, you are going to place it wherever you actually want to be sketching. The first thing I'm going to do is rotate the entire page, and then for the drawing, I'm also going to rotate that because I would really like to be able to use the same page that I did for the other methods, only so that on one page you can see the direct comparison of all three methods. I usually wouldn't be doing multiple sketches with different methods onto one paper. Then I change the opacity so it is only slightly visible. I create a new layer. I pick a nice little color and pencil, so we're going to do like a dark gray and a nice little pencil. This one just happens to be my favorite. And then what's really important is make sure you create a separate layer, because this way you can later hide this layer. And also, you know, if you make a mistake, you can erase without erasing the original reference. So that being said, I then just start tracing over. You can change the size here if you need to. And I'm noticing it's still a little difficult for me to see what I'm doing. So I'm going to reduce the opacity further. That'll make it easier. And now I can see exactly what's happening. When you're done with a sketch, you want to make sure you hide the layer of the scan, and then you will see what your sketch actually looks like on the page. So something else I do right before I print it out is I go to the layer that I did the sketch on, and again I reduce the opacity a little, because I want the sketch to be on the watercolor paper absolutely as light as possible. So now that I'm ready to have this printed, I need to move this to a device that can print. In my case, that's my laptop. So I could either airdrop it there if you use, you know, kind of Mac products all the way through. You could use Google Drive. You could use any method to transfer the file to your device. I'm going to take this piece of watercolor paper and I'm going to put it in the back of the printer, not the drawer, because I don't want to have to bend the paper any more than is necessary. So here we have it. Don't make the mistake I did and print it out the wrong way around. But this is the result of printing directly onto watercolor paper. I just love how fine the result is, because basically once I decrease the opacity after using a super fine digital pencil, you know, it becomes a much finer version than what I did here manually. So I want to go over a few of the pros and cons of each of the different methods. I'm going to be looking at my paper as I explain it so that I can really take the physical parts of what is happening and summarize that for you. So the first option with the graphite, I think what is lovely is that theoretically it is not a permanent mark on the paper, and it can be very light and delicate if you don't make the mistake I did going over it twice and moving the paper. It is, in comparison, quite a cost-effective method. It came in this big pack of, how many pages? 20 pages, and it was quite expensive. It was 28 Swiss francs. But, you know, those 20 pages, if you can reuse them frequently, are going to last a very long time. So in comparison, it is the most cost-effective method that I've shared. One of the cons that I don't really like about it is that, especially depending on the type of graphite paper that you get, it can start, when you start going over it with watercolor, kind of little flakes of the graphite seem to disintegrate and smudge up the watercolor, kind of mix in with it, and I really don't like that, which is one of the reasons that I have stopped using this method. But I think if you're just starting and you are an analog artist that doesn't use a lot of technology, it's a great option to start with. Now, the pros and cons of option number 2, which was the Lightbox. Actually, I don't think there's really any cons that I can think of. You can transfer things very lightly if you watch out. I pushed a little too hard, but I've done a better job in the past. So if you're very slow and very delicate, it will be the perfect transfer. And in the end, when you're done with the watercolor painting and everything is dried, you can very lightly, if you so choose, erase the watercolor marks, which really leaves you with this kind of borderless, very airy, ethereal painting, if that's what you're going for. So I really like that it is not a permanent mark on the paper and it doesn't smudge. Now, option number 3 is actually my current way of transferring. And so I always now do the method of sketching on an iPad after I have scanned the image and then printing it directly onto watercolor paper. For the longest time, I didn't realize you could print onto watercolor paper, and that can also be one of its cons because I don't think every printer is able to handle it that well. So you really have to consider the thickness or the GSM, the weight of the watercolor paper, and whether that is going to actually mess with your printer or the printer is going to mess with the paper. You definitely don't want to jam up your printer or cause any issues. So the paper I used was 300 GSM, and it did happen to work on my printer. A few of the cons of printing directly onto watercolor paper is that it is very unforgiving. It is a permanent mark. So if you print it the wrong way around or you make any kind of other mistake, there goes your watercolor paper. And something else that I think is really important to consider, depending on the type of art that you do, is that this is permanent. You cannot erase that away when you're done with your painting. So you have to be able to live with a very fine line, but the line will remain. Watercolor paper has an incredibly fragile texture. It requires that texture so that it can really absorb the watercolor in the correct way. So if you start sketching onto watercolor paper and you're not certain of the final design yet, and you start adding an eraser and just, go over it 10 times, you destroy the texture of the watercolor paper, meaning that it can no longer function. You're going to have all sorts of bleeds. It's just going to be a really ugly scenario. And basically, if you do that to your watercolor paper before you start painting, you're going to waste the entire time because it's almost guaranteed that your watercolor painting will not look right. You're going to encounter a lot of issues that you wouldn't have if you just used a really fresh piece of paper that doesn't have a bunch of destruction. So I definitely recommend do not start sketching on watercolor paper unless you are very, very, very confident that you're not going to be making any changes or mistakes. That's why I save that for the very last step in the process before I start painting. If you enjoyed this video, then check out this playlist that I created. It is going to grow and grow and includes a lot of my tips and tricks and how-tos for budding watercolor artists just like you.